We've talked about a good handful of haunted locations here so far. Cemeteries and old mansions seem to dominate the conversation, but what can't be overlooked are the amount of stories from former lunatic asylums or hospitals, many of which we'll cover here sometime in the future. Many paranormal enthusiasts recognize the names of these buildings immediately. Waverly Hills, Bryce Hospital, Rolling Hills, the list goes on and on. For this one though, let's go ahead and get West Virginia in the mix and visit one of my favorite locations to watch paranormal investigations at. Let's look at the histories and stories of Weston State Hospital, better known as Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture. Some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. In the 1850s, the Virginia General Assembly granted authorization for construction of a new hospital, one that would focus on the actual curing of mental patients rather than simply safety and security. In 1858, construction began on the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, and even though the initial intentions seemed to be on the up and up, the building would go on to be a house of horrors, suffering with severe overcrowding, inhumane conditions, and eruptions of violence for the next 140 years, culminating with it becoming one of the most haunted locations of its kind in America. Initial construction was halted in 1861 by the outbreak of the Civil War, though, and what sections of the hospital that had been completed were taken over by both Union and Confederate forces at different times, even serving as Camp Tyler briefly for Union forces. An attempt at continuing construction was made, but the project suffered from continued confiscation of building materials by both forces. Following the split of Virginia into two states, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum now found itself in the newly formed state of West Virginia in 1863, and changed its name to the Weston Virginia House for the Insane. Construction continued on through 1881, but the first patient was admitted in October of 1864, a housewife that records indicate suffered from, quote, domestic issues. The first logbook records many issues such as this, the most common showing admitted patients being there for grief, depression, brain congestion, feebleness of intellect, seduction, and novel reading. In fact, those early days saw patients admitted for strange, quote, conditions such as asthma, laziness, religious enthusiasm, menopause, being superstitious, domestic troubles, masturbation, and tuberculosis. Asylums such as this often became a dumping ground for those that became deemed society's unwanted. And interestingly enough, Trans-Allegheny, along with others at the time, offered money to anyone that dropped patients off at the facility, even though they showed no signs of any mental illness. The design of the complex allowed for 250 residents, and from the beginning, the hospital was largely self-sufficient. They raised their own vegetables, had their own ice house, and even raised a dairy herd. They had their own water reservoir, and a local coal mine supplied the hospital with fuel for heat. All of the patients' clothing, curtains, and other fabrics were made on site, as well as mattresses and furniture. This was a popular 19th century ideal for mental institutions, that they be self-sufficient and that patients learn a trade. Another well-followed train of thought for these institutions, one that Trans-Allegheny was no exception to, was that they were located in rural areas. The idea was that it would benefit patients to be around complete strangers. Patients were discouraged from seeing anyone they knew, and were even denied gifts and mail. Trans-Allegheny sat on 600 acres, and in keeping with the idea of seclusion and being self-sufficient, the ground even held its own cemetery for those that passed away while housed there, one that reportedly now holds more than 2,000 unmarked graves. Construction completed in 1881 with a grand total of $725,000, more than $300,000 over the original budget. The building was 4 stories tall, 1,295 feet long, and contained 2.5 miles of hallways. The walls were 2.5 feet thick enough to muffle any screams that came from inside. Even today, Trans-Allegheny remains the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in North America, and reportedly the second largest in the world, second only to the Kremlin. At the time of completion in 1881, Trans-Allegheny housed over 700 patients, well over the original 250 that the building's design called for. Starting out, it seemed that the staff had the best of intentions, but unfortunately, the science at the time was not on their side. Some of the, quote, healing techniques that the staff at Trans-Allegheny administered were bloodletting and induced insulin coma therapy. Any patient deemed violent were kept in seclusion rooms or confinement cribs. Remember now, many of the patients there were innocent castaways from society with nothing that would even come close to a mental issue diagnosis by today's standards. In 1913, the institute's name was changed again to Weston State Hospital. The 20th century brought about changes to the hospital. New buildings were always being erected and filled as soon as they were completed. By this time, the hospital had shifted to more of a treatment facility than any attempt at any kind of rehabilitation. The hospital now was being plagued with overcrowding and funding issues, those being further strained in October of 1935 by a patient-set fire that damaged most of the 4th floor. Surprisingly enough, no one lost their lives in that fire, but the financial hit the hospital took left its mark, costing $155,000 to repair, a small fortune for the 1930s. In 1938, the asylum housed 1,661 patients, including people with epilepsy, alcoholics, and drug addicts, on top of the typical patients they were already known for. By 1949, the patient count at the hospital had risen to 1,800. That same year, the Charleston Gazette reported that the facility had poor sanitation and insufficient furniture, lighting, and heating in much of the complex. The hospital's population peaked in the 1950s at 2,400 patients, roughly 10 times the number it had originally been built to accommodate. This was likely one of the worst times for patients at the hospital, with the overcrowding and understaffed conditions. Anyone who complained or acted out was placed in solitary confinement, chained to the walls of an empty room for months at a time. During these years, several new medical treatments were introduced there, such as ice water baths and electroshock therapy, finally escalating with the introduction of the transorbital lobotomy, more commonly known as the ice pick lobotomy, named for the ice pick-looking device that was driven through the patient's orbital socket into the brain with a sharp blow from a hammer. It left patients with severe brain damage, but was thought at the time to relieve patients from more severe symptoms. In 1952, one doctor alone on site performed 228 of these lobotomies in the span of just 2 weeks. Overcrowding continued to take its toll as well, leaving staff unable to control the patient population. Violence between patients became commonplace, even escalating to patients killing other patients. In one particular instance, 2 patients attacked another patient and hung him with a pair of bed sheets. When the patient didn't die, the other 2 cut him down, then used a metal bed frame to crush his head. Hospital staff weren't safe from the violence either. Many staff reported being attacked while on duty, and several of the female staff reported assaults of a sexual nature, if you catch my drift. One nurse even went missing, her body found 2 months later, rotting at the base of an unused stairwell. The hospital continued operation though. In 1985, the Charleston Gazette again exposed the asylum, reporting that court-appointed inspectors found the asylum to be, quote, dirty and unkept, with many patients left naked and confined to dirty wards with bathrooms smeared with feces. In 1992, the Charleston Gazette again called out the conditions inside the hospital. That same year, a patient named George Edward Bodie died after a fight with another patient. Another patient, Brian Scott B., died from self-inflicted injuries, and his body was not found for 8 days. The hospital finally closed in 1994 due to changes in patients' treatment and the facility's physical deterioration. Trans-Allegheny then stood vacant for years until the hospital was finally auctioned off in August 2007, and Joe Jordan bought it for $1.5 million. Today, Trans-Allegheny is open for guided historical and paranormal tours, as well as nighttime ghost hunts. The tales of ghosts and hauntings at Trans-Allegheny started well before the hospital closed down, though. It was only open for a few decades when reports first started back in the 1800s. There were also reports of former staff members quitting after only a few days on the job. Their reasoning? It was because of unexplained noises in the hallway and the feelings of constantly being watched. The ghosts at Trans-Allegheny range from the spirits of Civil War soldiers to former patients and staff, and even children that lost their lives within the walls. Ghostly figures are reported walking down the halls at night, and shadow figures can be seen at all hours, both day and night. There are also reports of balls of light, and many figures dressed in white. Some visitors have even reported spirits becoming attached to them and following them home, many of which still suffer from hauntings to this day. The first floor of the complex is said to be inhabited by a ghost named Ruth, and Ruth seems to hate male visitors. No connection has ever been made to any former patient or staff members named Ruth, though, and it isn't known why the spirit of Ruth has these feelings. Still, though, many male visitors report being shoved into walls moments after hearing a whistling sound in the hallway. On the second floor, remaining spirits from some previous violent events seem to still stick around. This floor's history has seen a patient stabbed 17 times by another patient, as well as a number of suicide cases. This floor is one of the largest hotspots for people encountering shadow figures in the hallways and rooms, and EVP recordings have been caught telling visitors to get out. The third floor is where the attempted hanging, followed by the crushing of the patient's head with a bed frame, took place. The ghost of this unfortunate individual is said to still haunt that very room, and visitors have experienced or heard the sound of an old metal bed frame suddenly having one corner lifted slightly before slamming back to the floor. The third floor also houses the ghost of a patient named Big Jim and a former nurse named Elizabeth. People also report doors opening and closing on their own, glimpses of ghost or shadow figures, and a number of strange noises. It's the fourth floor that seems to draw the most visitors, though. It's said that the spirit of a child remains there, a girl named Lily. Lily has been seen wearing a white dress, and witnesses describe her as being around 9 or 10 years old. Many visitors bring and leave behind toys and other gifts for Lily, and they are kept all within a single room. The stories say that Lily waits patiently in the toy room for someone to come play with her, and she's been known to play games with the visitors. Toys have been witnessed moving on their own, and there is a music box that sometimes turns on by itself when Lily is politely asked to do so. The legend around Lily has sprung up to say that she was a former patient. One story says she was dropped off there by her parents, while another says that she was born at the asylum from a pregnant patient, thus spending her entire life within the walls of Trans-Allegheny. Both stories agree that she died at the age of 9 from pneumonia. Those that try to visit Lily on the fourth floor have something else to contend with before making it to her room, though. The fourth floor is home to an entity that has become known as the Creeper. No one is exactly sure what the Creeper actually is, but it's described as a black mass that appears to crawl along the floor. Visitors report a dark, sinister feeling on this floor, regardless of if they have witnessed the Creeper or not. The entirety of the complex experiences the sound of banging, screams, slamming doors, distant moans, and sometimes even laughter coming from empty rooms. One can only imagine the type of tortured souls this place housed while in operation, and what kinds still remain there today. Even those that were housed there from various misdiagnoses, can you imagine what mental state these people were finally broken down to, spending their entire lives within the walls of an asylum that they knew they didn't belong at? I can't imagine that. And the more I think about it, I don't want to be able to imagine that.